Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started here. Hi, welcome to our next session here at the Munich Security Conference. My name is Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine and the host of FP Live, on which we are also live streaming this session. The name of this session is titled Tariff-fying Times, and I feel like that name itself gives you a very good sense of the mood when it comes to America's tariffs on much of the world and what that has done to weaponized trade. So let me just introduce our four excellent panelists on stage. I ask you to hold your applause, and once they're all on stage, let's hear it for them. They are Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Alexander Stubb, the President of Finland, Lars Klingbeil, the Vice Chancellor of Germany and also the Minister of Finance, and Tom Tillis, Republican Senator from North Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for our guests. Welcome to all of you. It's great to have you here. Director General Okonjo-Iweala, I'm going to start with you. We're now in year 2 of Trump's second term, and I remember this time last year, the word you kept using was chill. And you kept telling us that, you know, let's wait and see what happens when it comes to tariffs. Well, now it's been a year. We have some data. We know what's happened. And it seems to me you've begun to sound a lot more concerned about the state of affairs.
Well, thanks, Ravi, and good afternoon, everyone. When I said chill, it wasn't that good afternoon, everyone. When I said chill, it wasn't that I wasn't concerned. I was very concerned. But what I meant was reacting quickly to these announcements without thinking through what kind of approach you need to have, I didn't think was the best way to go. Because at least for my members at the WTO, because the reaction then would be immediately, okay, I need to hit back. And I thought it would be worthwhile thinking it through. There's one thing you need to know. It's not all about trade or tariffs. The tariffs, so many other things are linked into it. Security issues, immigration issues, energy issues. So when you're dealing with that kind of situation, you need to think through your reaction and your action. If you start a tariff war, can you carry it through? Would it be better to have dialogue? We've been there before in the 1930s, and it was a bad movie. So that's why I said chill.
So take us to 2026 now. How concerned are you?
Oh, I'm still concerned. I mean, we've got a situation in which the U.S. average weighted tariffs have now gone from about 2.6 to about 18% in our numbers. These are the announced tariffs, but the actual applied tariffs are closer to 14%. That's still a big leap, the same, almost as the same number announced by the New York Fed, at 13%. So this is a big change and a big leap in protective measures. And I will always say, look, I may not agree with the US's unilateral actions or approach to dealing with the issues, but I do agree with a lot of their criticisms of the system. And what I would like to say is that the system has not evolved, has not been quick to change and respond to the changing world. And some of those criticisms about it not functioning well are good, and it's across administrations. It's not just this administration, but various ones. I see Mike Froman sitting in the audience, and I think he was also one of the critics. So we may not like the action, but we must take the signal that we need to reform many of the things with the world trading system. So that is where we are now. And then the second point I want to make, and I know people don't like to hear this, in spite of the massive disruption of the system, the biggest we've seen in the past 80 years, an undermining of global trade rules, the system is proving resilient. I will keep saying it, that 72% of world's goods trade is still on WTO terms. So battered, bruised, but not broken. Those are my words. The system is still largely functioning. So partly This explains my calm nerves, chill. And I'll end by saying that I want to give my members, I am very proud of them because they didn't descend into tit for tat with the US. If they'd done that, the world would be much worse off than where we are now.
Fair enough, that's a good point. Vice Chancellor Klingbeil, about an hour ago, we all heard from Chancellor Merz and his words that the international order is over. Do you want to build on that? I mean, that sounds so different than what we've just heard from the Director General.
So, first of all, I think Chancellor Merz gave a very powerful and very good speech. And he was giving orientation for the whole Munich Security Conference. And he was analyzing that the world order as we know, it's over. But I think he gave a good overview, and I totally support that if we do the right things now, we have a possibility to form something like a new order. I'm totally convinced that this world order we all know, formed by blocks, this is over. We will face a world order where we see different power centers. And all these power centers will find relationships, dependencies, maybe conflicts. And he was very clear, and I support that Europe has to work very hard, that we are an attractive and also very powerful center in this world. Germany has to do the homework for that. Europe has to do homework. And so, I mean, it's always that in Germany or Europe, we look what is the US president doing as next. And I think we should, I mean, we have to see what he's doing next, but we can do our homework. We can work on our European sovereignty, we can work on competitiveness, we can work on defense. And if we do that, I think Europe will have a powerful place in this new world order. And then there was also a very clear signal that we are looking for new partners. So I'm really happy that we now have, after 26 years, this EU-Mercosur deal, and we will finish the last steps in the next weeks, I think. I'm very happy that we have now this agreement with India, and let me say that at last point, I'm totally clear. I'm convinced that tariffs are bad for the people, tariffs are bad for the economy on both sides of the transatlantic. But if US and the government is willing to go this way, we have to find other partners, we have to strengthen our economic growth. And I think Chancellor Merz was very clear on this, and I support him.
President Stubb, if I can bring you in, I think you're the perfect person for the question I want to ask you. You not only have a PhD in international relations, you also represent a small country, at least by population size. And I'm worried when I look at new data from UNCTAD, the UN body on trade and development, which shows that US tariffs, they always sort of gave a competitive advantage to bigger countries and rich countries than they did to smaller countries. And in the last year, that difference has been exacerbated. So richer countries have been able to strike their own deals with the United States and also elsewhere, as we just heard. Smaller countries get left behind. What advice do you have for the world if we are headed into this new order where bigger countries can manage and the weaker ones suffer?
Join the European Union. Gives you protection.
What about the rest?
No, I mean, just to rewind, I think what we're seeing right now with tariffs, protectionism in general, it's the reversal of the world that we experienced after the end of the Cold War, where the basic idea was that trade would be liberalized, many countries would revert to liberal democracy and globalization in general. So the things that were supposed to bring us together, like currency, energy, trade, technology, even information, they're now being weaponized. And that's what we're seeing sort of in the post-2022 world, where we start talking about worries of value chains, which used to be a given in any kind of a free trading system. Now, I want to sort of counter your thesis a little bit. A country like Finland has not been hit any worse than Germany vis-a-vis the United States. Why? Because there's exclusive competence on customs, there's exclusive competence on trade, there's exclusive competence on competition policy. and there is exclusive competence on currency or monetary policy in the European Union. So we're shielded from that. So when there's a threat after the Greenland issue that, you know, we will raise tariffs to 25% with Finland, well, you can't do that because then it's 25% for the European Union. So, you know, we feel quite good in this place. What should smaller states or middle powers do? I think we should lean in and support the multilateral trading institutions such as the WTO. And Ngozi has told me that 72% of world trade still is based on WTO rules. And I think what Europe will end up doing is hedging and de-risking a little bit. That's why you see a quick trade agreement finally with Mercosur. You see a trade agreement with India. I don't exclude some kind of investment agreement in the long run with China either. And I think you're going to start seeing this type of behavior coming from other countries as well. So instead of leaning in on tariffs and a multipolar world and retaliation, people are going to start saying, okay, let's go back to the rules that existed because they were much more stable. And this, I think, pertains to both small countries and big countries.
I want to dig at that a bit more, but I'm going to put a pin in that because let me bring in Senator Tillis first. Senator, you've emerged as a rare Republican lawmaker who's criticized President Trump on the issue of tariffs. Are you getting a sense that 1 year in, that the White House and Trump in particular, are they getting less ideological on the issue of tariffs?
Actually, I just want to make it clear. I haven't criticized President Trump on tariffs. I've criticized the people who have convinced him that this is the right way to move forward. Look, we have instances...
hang on, are you sure that the president himself doesn't believe that tariffs are a good thing? I'm pretty sure.
Does anybody really believe?
Well,
I've got a friend here. Do you know everything about all the inner workings of public policy for your great nation, or do you rely on experts to give you best advice that you act on?
No, not at all. I'm completely authoritarian.
So my point here is the United States is a large, complex country. If any president would assert that they by themselves could create strategies and execute on them, they're lying to you. They rely on experts, and I believe that there are experts that are giving the wrong signals to the president on this issue. But let's go back and figure out how we got here, right? I see somebody in the audience that was responsible for negotiating TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So close, but we came up short. Can you imagine if we'd gotten through the very few issues that prevented that agreement, that trade agreement, ratified by Congress, through Congress, how different we would be in Indo-PACOM right now with a partnership of 11 nations trading together. But it fell to the wayside for various reasons because what we were trying to do is then have an on-ramp for TTIP. Can you imagine if we got through with TTIP, what our relationships would be like with Europe right now? And then instead of putting a priority on resolving our differences, we let an inherent problem fester, and then we find ourselves with so-called Liberation Day. So at the end of the day, I am a free trader, but I do believe that we have to have fair trade. And I do believe that there are some countries where we need to have a balance of trade. I also believe that there are struggling countries, if we exit and create an untenable environment to trade, that China will step in, that Russia will step in, and malign influences will. We have to understand there's a balance here, and trade policy goes hand in hand with national security policy, and at this point, I think we're at a bit of an imbalance. Just another note, and I'll let you go to another question. I didn't pay attention to the socks that I was putting on this morning, but it occurs to me that it's President Abraham Lincoln who presided over our Civil War, right? Well, we're not in a civil war with our partners and allies in Europe. We're in a frank discussion that needs to be had. But if anyone believes that the Congress of the United States think that our future is anywhere else but building stronger relationships with our partners and allies first, and then tried to work with our would-be adversaries second, then I think they're getting caught up in the rhetoric of American politics and not the reality of what people like me and the majority of my colleagues in Congress intend to get done.
So, Senator, I just have to circle back to where you began that answer, because I'll confess I'm slightly gobsmacked, because it was my understanding that the president himself was very ideological about tariffs. And so I'm a little bit surprised by your answer. But given what you say, the basic question still remains the same. If it is these advisors who are pushing him in this direction that you clearly disagree with, I mean, you don't like what happened on Liberation Day. So the question remains, is any pressure on them coming to bear?
Well, I think, you know, unless the world of economics has flipped since my time as a partner at Price Waterhouse, how can you possibly expect prolonged imposition of tariffs in excess of 10%, not ultimately affecting consumers? That's just the way the world works. And so we have to understand that this sustained imposition, you know, most firms can absorb 10% tariffs, and they do so competitively until they figure out where the market settles down. But when you impose a 50% tariff on Brazil because you didn't like a judicial outcome, that's not a strategic use of tariffs.
You're saying what every single economist says. I guess the question is, how is this not breaking through to the White House?
Well, because I think, again, if you think about the president, this is something I'll probably get a groan or two on. See, the president has to process a lot of signals through a lot of different channels, right? So on the one hand, he's hearing rightfully from Mike Waltz and others that Europe has failed to pay its fair share in NATO, burden sharing. Now they're catching up, and thank you for that, because that's taking an argument off the table. But if you're dealing with a country that on the one hand is falling short on their burden sharing, and also enjoying a trade, we have a trade deficit with them, then those are two data points that the president's responding to as an executive, not as somebody who's crafting the strategy. I see people in the audience who have served in other presidential administrations. We know how this works. You bring your best experts to the table. He's hearing these signals and going, okay, on the one hand, we're paying more for our mutual defense, and on the other hand, we're leaving money on the table in terms of trade imbalances. So I think you have to be strategic. And I was in Davos, I said, look, you have to de-risk at some level. But to make the statement that the free world and the family of NATO nations is no more, I think is hyperbolic and will not withstand the test of time. Because you have a Congress and an American people that understand that our future, our past, and our present is rooted in Western rules of law democracies.
Got it. Well, I mean, in Davos, certainly that was an unpopular feeling given the threats against Greenland. I'm going to move on, but I'll come back to you. Director General, the question we were lingering on earlier about smaller countries. So, again, the data suggests that smaller countries are particularly disadvantaged by US tariffs. And if we sort of broaden out from just that particular case, what should the WTO do to allow smaller countries to have a more equitable rules-based system?
Well, we have to look carefully at the data. As the president said, not all small countries. It depends on what your trade is. You know, African countries, I say this is one time, maybe it's good not to matter so much. Trade with 6% of our imports, exports to the US and 4% of our imports. When we do the analysis, there is some impact, but it's not as bad as one might expect. Less than 1% of GDP growth hit. But that's also not a good thing, because it means the continent is not so connected or integrated into world markets. I'm just using that as an example. But the truth of it is this. If it is a power game, small countries are disadvantaged. So it's not only about trade, it's also about power and what you can be made to do or not made to do outside of the multilateral system. Now, let me say this. Of my 166 members, about 140 have trade to GDP ratios north of 50%. So trade, so that's the point you're making. Trade for them is an existential issue, whether it's trade with the US or elsewhere. For the EU, for instance, the trade to GDP ratio is about 93%. For the US, 25%, China, 38%. So there are some big, large countries that can maybe somehow make it on their own, but a whole host of others who may not. And so the question is, what should be done? And I think that what needs to be done is for those members and countries to have what I call agency. I would like to say that, yes, the US has upended the rules-based order. Global trade rules are being undermined. But the US is 13% of world imports, 11% of world trade. What is happening to the other 89%? Can other countries please have agency? Can we please try to act? Do we have to spend all the time lamenting? I know it's the biggest economy and China is the second largest, but sometimes when I hear people speak, that's not the way I approach this. Okay, so the US has done all these things. Can the middle powers come together and say we find the system valuable, as President Stubb is saying, and we are going to support it? And therefore, we will support the rules-based system. And since the world trade is still largely, goods trade is still largely on those terms, could we get together and say what works within the system that we can keep? And what is it that doesn't work? Because a lot is also broken that we need to fix. The system is resilient, but it's not robust. So we need to make it robust by doing the necessary reforms, and that is what we're working on at the WTO. But I want us to have more agency. I'm tired of too much lamentation. Oh, the US has broken the world. Oh, the world all has come to an end. I'm sorry to say all this, but it would be better if people really sat up. Europe has the chance to lead the middle powers and support the system. And let's us just do a little bit down with the lamentations and get going on trying to do the right thing.
Very hard to disagree with that. President Stubb, we just heard China get a quick mention, so let's go there. Both in terms of tariffs, but also geopolitics more broadly. I'm curious how you're thinking about the value proposition that Europe has, and America has as well, vis-a-vis China. When you look at the next 30, 40 years as a contest for power, as a contest that involves much of the global south looking for partnerships, looking for allies in a messy new order, what is the value proposition you're trying to put forward?
Sure. Before I answer, if I was reading the Director General correctly, not only do I agree with everything she said, but she just called Finland a middle power. So thank you.
You're really sitting up tall now. That's good.
Yeah, I'm sitting. All 6'3" of it. So what's the value proposition? So my thinking is that we're living in a triangle of power where you have the global West, the global South, and the global East. The global East is led by China. The global West was led by the United States. And then the global South was the one that felt it might have to take a choice between the two. And I think the choice right now is fairly binary. You have those who support a multipolar world, which is transactional, deal-based, and based on spheres of interest. And then you have those who support a multilateral world, like Ngozi and myself, and I think probably most people here on the stage. We support the idea of international institutions, rules, norms, and cooperation. So then we have to ask ourselves the question, for demographic reasons, for economic reasons, for geopolitical reasons, it's going to be the global South that decides the next world order. And how do we make a value proposition? What I've tried to do is to say that we should base our foreign policy on values-based realism, so to be true to your values, human rights, fundamental rights, democracy, freedom, rule of law, but be realistic. You cannot solve issues of trade, conflict, climate, or technology just with like-minded countries. So reach out. And I think that there is this battle for hearts and minds right now. To a certain extent, China is doing it, the US is doing it. So then, for me as a European, my idea is that we need to drive a dignified foreign policy, which means that reach out to the middle powers, do the trade deals with India, do the trade deals with Mercosur, open up your markets. And in that sense, take a different type of approach, because in my experience in diplomacy, you get more out of a system if you act in a dignified manner. My final point, I think what we need to do is we need to reform the international institutions. The UN, the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank. Why? because they were created in the image of the West and the United States 80 years ago. Their power structure is there. It's antiquated. If we want multilateralism to win, we need to give agency and power to the global South.
Vice Chancellor, can I ask you to build on that? Is the German perspective here the same as what President Stubb was describing, or are there any variations that you want to add to that?
No, I would agree. I mean, I have to say again, for us in Germany, the most important part is now to make Europe stronger and work on the European sovereignty. When it comes to the question of competitiveness, we are 450 million people. So if we have a single market, if we have a capital market, if we have a common defense market, this will bring Europe in a really powerful role. And it's just us deciding if we want to go this way or not. If it comes to simplification, it's not United States, it's not China, it's just us deciding if we go this way. But we can really be a power in the international system. And the second point is, and I really want to underline, when it comes to Global South, I think Mercosur is very important, India, the trade deals are very important, but there are so many countries in the world that wants to work together with us in Europe. And I know that from a lot of trips I made as a party leader or now as the Vice Chancellor and Minister of Finance, if you come to several states in Africa, in Latin America, also in Asia, everyone is telling us, okay, Russia was here, China's here, they're doing deals, where are the Europeans? And I think this is what we have to recognize, that we have to become stronger when it comes to make trade deals, fair trade deals with the Global South. And so we can bring these countries in a stronger relationship with Europe. And then I also want to underline that we have to reform the institutions. I mean, everything is about international institutions, it's about rules-based institutions, it's about common policy, but we have to talk about the representation of the Global South in these institutions. And I think if this debate is starting from Europe, we can also build trust with our partners in the Global South and all of this. And again, I want to thank you for your clear statement for the transatlantic partnership. But we have to face the situation as it is. We have a president in the White House that is having threats with tariffs, and we have a competitor with China who's doing an unfair trade relationship with us when it comes to subsidies from the state, when it comes to overcapacities, when we see how China is flooding the European market. So we have to be stronger also on trade policy, but I think for Europe there are a lot of opportunities and I think we should use them.
Director General, did you want to jump in on that? It seems like they're following your message immediately about agency.
Sounds great. No, just a couple of numbers on this. Although many people, this definition of Global South and Global North is also, we need to just also be careful about it because there are a lot of differences. But taking it as it is, in 1995, the Global North or developed countries contributed 60% of world GDP and the Global South 40%. Today, those numbers are reversed. It is now the Global South contributes 60% of global GDP and the North 40%. In 1995, 10%, South-South trade was 10% of world trade. Today it's 25%. So there are shifts and movements that dictate that, yes, we need to look at those, we need to pay attention. And the third point I wanted to make on that is that, look, the arrangements with whether it's Global South, South-South trade or North-South trade or arrangements with the Global South, this is all part of trying to diversify trade. And that is why at the WTO, we do support these trade arrangements, whether it's the EU-Mercosur that took 24 years and other trade arrangements. We support them because they help diversification of trade away from US, which were, so many countries were overly dependent on the US for demand. And overly dependent on China for critical supplies. So I think diversifying away from both of these and giving yourself the flexibility is a good thing. And if it's with the Global South, Why not?
And of course, the White House's policies have accelerated that process. I want to go to the audience now to take a few questions. If you can raise your hand, and we'll have a microphone weave its way over to you. I see in row 3 we have a lady. If you can identify yourself, ma'am, and then a question, not a comment, please.
Thank you. My name is Tytti Tuppurainen. I'm a member of the Finnish Parliament. I really like what the Director General said about the rest should unite. I think that's really the right way to go. But that brings us to the question of how to engage with China. And I think it needs regulation. Otherwise, we wouldn't be on the equal footing with China. We need to regulate. How does it fit together with the growing sentiment of deregulation in our countries, especially here in Europe, but also in the United States? Deregulation, but the need to regulate. How do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that China believes or wants to support and says it wants to support the multilateral trading system because it has benefited quite a bit from it. China recognizes, or at least we are passing the message, that the export-led growth model that drove China's growth for the past 40 years cannot drive China's growth for the next 40. And the $1.2 trillion trade surplus is not sustainable because the rest of the world cannot absorb it. So these are the messages we are passing to China. So China needs to act. And with the trade with China having dropped, trade between China and the US having dropped 20% last year, the trade is flowing to other places. Europe, 8%. Africa is actually getting the largest flows, 26%. ASEAN, 13%. Latin America, 8%. So it's going everywhere. And if China does not act, we will see more barriers. So what we're saying is within the WTO rules, there are tools. They are not perfect, but there are tools that can be used to deal with this. The EU knows that also, or the EC, and they're bringing some of it. So I'm not sure it's your regulation. I wouldn't say more regulation. I think it's dialogue. I think it's agreements with China, plus using some of the multilateral tools at hand.
I'm going to take maybe a couple of questions together. They are both in the front row, as it were, and then I promised to diversify a little bit. If we can get a microphone out here. There's a gentleman here, right in front of me, and then the lady in the front.
Hi, Michał Baranowski. I'm a Deputy Minister of Economy in Poland, responsible for trade, so very much the front seat of the current debates. One question, perhaps, to the Senator is, if we were not focused so much on each other transatlantically, we would be talking about overcapacities in third countries, China specifically. Do you see an appetite, because we are not seeing it as much on the executive, in the US to engage in this? And if I may, to President of Finland, to what extent are you concerned and how do we address the dilemmas of sometimes having trade and security issues being touched very closely also by our closest allies? Thanks.
Those are great questions. Do you mind holding on to those in your heads? And we'll just take one more question here. Ma'am, I think we have a microphone right there. Yes, go for it.
Hello, thank you. Alicia Batsman, Ukrainian media, Gordon editor-in-chief. I have one short question for President, Mr. President. Based on Finland's historical experience, please give Ukraine a recipe how we can defeat Russia and Putin.
All right, thank you. I will just point out, we're here to talk about tariffs today, but I'm going to allow it a little bit of divergence. Gentlemen, quick answers, please.
Well, in my case on trade, I think that it was announced on April the 2nd, not the 1st, because we all know April the 1st is April Fool's Day.
No, it's my birthday.
Yeah.
It's a very nice day.
But I went into my office when I saw the announcement, and I told my staff, if the rest of our Western allies are smart, they will have a multilateral coordinated response. They will de-risk. They will build trading blocks. And frankly, I think all of that is healthy. Because, you know, in some respects, I play a lot of different kind of sports. I love mountain biking. And I only get faster if I have somebody riding on my heels or that I've got to catch up with. And quite honestly, I think we've lost that spirit of, I'll call it not competition, but co-opetition, that comes through having a multilateral bloc that is at a more level playing field when the United States decides to make moves like this in the future. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it makes us better if we do it right. But I've got to, China is loving this discussion right now. China is loving the fact that we're imposing tariffs on countries that we have complex relationships with, that need some forgiveness on the part of the United States, because it's more than just about the economic relationship. It's more about helping them develop. It's more about checking China and Russia's malign influence in areas of the world, think Africa and think South America. So anybody who's advising the president thinking that our spreadsheets all need to tally on some nation that's just barely developing in a young democracy or maybe a benevolent dictatorship misses the history lesson. We have to be present. When we have a discussion about how China plays into the role of Western nations, I think about their metastasizing again and NATO allies with Huawei. We all remember the argument about how we had to de-Huawei from our NATO allies so our communications infrastructure is solid. Let's not repeat that mistake. But at the same time, we've got to recognize that co-opetition is good. I'm not the least bit frightened by a well-defined multilateral response to the U.S. so that we understand our limits and we build on that.
All right. President Stubb, go ahead with the trade answer. Maybe a super short. I know you've spoken about Ukraine extensively in other forums, so I'll leave you to a quick one there.
I can't hesitate because Tom talked about Huawei and we're in Germany. You can always switch from Huawei to Nokia. It's a really safe network, and it works really well.
Never miss an opportunity.
I never do. On the trade issue, a very short answer because I think it's linked to the fundamentals of our transatlantic partnership. You will know that I'm pro-European, pro-American, and therefore, like Peter sitting next to you, by definition, pro-transatlanticist. I think there's a lot of noise in the transatlantic relationship right now. I think an element that Tom was bringing forward is correct. We need to take more responsibility when it comes to security. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there are issues with where we can work with the Americans, NATO, defense, technology, minerals. In our case, actually, icebreakers. You know, there's a dependency in the other way. So there are a lot of things that we can do. And then let's cordially disagree on things that are linked to the EU or international institutions, the liberal world order, and climate change. Then on Ukraine, I promised to bring in the tariffs on this. Very briefly, I'm not going to give you advice, but I think you're winning this war. And the reason I say this is that Putin has failed strategically. He wanted to make Ukraine Russian, it became European. He wanted to prevent the enlargement of NATO, he got Finland and Sweden. And he wanted to keep our defense expenditure down, and it's now going up to 5%. Secondly, he's losing on the military front. Remember that when the war began, Russia acquired 12% of Ukrainian territory. That's 12 years ago. Since then, 8%. In the past 2 years, 1%. In December, Ukraine was able to kill 34,000 Russian soldiers. They were not able to recruit back. So my answer is just keep on what you're doing, and at the end of the day, you will prevail and win this war.
All right. We have just a little bit of time left, so I'm going to take a couple more questions on tariffs, please. Row 3, I see Natalie Tocci. If we can get a microphone over to her. And then there's one hand at the back. You know who you are. Yes.
Question to President Stubb. So earlier you juxtaposed a multilateral and a multipolar system. And that resonates, of course. Although I'm wondering whether the two models that we have before us, and of course I'm slightly simplifying here, is on the one hand a rules-based multipolarity, which I guess kind of fits into your principled realism, and on the other hand, a model of imperial collusion. Where obviously there are wannabe empires from Russia to China to the United States. And of course, you know, those empires eventually could end up being rivals and compete and maybe even conflict. But for the time being, they seem to be more interested in establishing their spheres of influences, be it through security, be it through economic coercion. So if that's the alternative model, how is it that both we as Europeans, but in general, the multilateral system, can act to prevent that scenario?
Okay, President Stubb, just hold on to that one. And there was one last question there. I think that's Dan Dresner.
It is. Thank you very much. Dan Dresner from the Fletcher School. My question is about the intersection of security and trade, which all of you seem to acknowledge is certainly an important issue. I guess on the transatlantic relationship then, to what extent does this mean, President Stubb, that Europe, in terms of building out, using the 5% of its GDP to spend on defense, should actually de-link from buying US weapons and start developing its own military-industrial complex? And to Senator Tillis, what are the implications of that for the United States?
Okay, President Stubb, take it away.
Just fresh out of a meeting with the CEO of Lockheed, who we just purchased. We just bought 64 F-35s. So am I the right person to answer the question? But I'll go to Natalie first. I think you're onto something on this. My answer is to say that there are countries that would like to go back to the 19th century, concert of powers and spheres of interest. And you could certainly say that, you know, Russia has been there, China to a certain extent, and one could argue that perhaps the US administration as well. Now, what do we then need to do? I think then we come back to Ngozi's point and to Mark Carney's point. I think the middle powers need to come together and hedge their bets into multilateralism. I was at the G20 meeting in Johannesburg, and I felt that 18 out of the 20 Gs felt very strongly about multilateralism. What do? We need to change the power structure. So therefore, double the number of countries in the UN Security Council. Get one from Latin America, two from Africa, and 2 from Asia. Think about what Europe should do with its position in the UN Security Council. So this is just a beginning. So when you give agency, they start working with it. Then we come to the question of de-risking from US defense. I don't think this is a binary issue, purely black and white. What we'll see is still a lot of presence of American defense industry. Why? Because it's so extremely good on, for instance, F-35s or on long-range missiles. But what you'll also see now is Europe coming forward with different types of plans of bringing their own defense industry together. I look at a country like Finland. We have an extremely good space cluster. I look at countries like Sweden and Norway. They have strong defense industries. So it's not going to be a decoupling because we need each other and we trust each other. Again, I come back to the point that trade, security, and the transatlantic partnership, it has worked before, and I don't see any reason why it should not work in the future. We just have to get this right, be a little bit more cool, calm, and collected.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that decoupling only benefits our would-be adversaries. It makes no sense. What we have to do, but again, I hate to go back to it, but I must, a $2 trillion shortfall in the prior commitment for NATO allies over 20 years. If we had those demand signals and all the modernization, the things that could have come with it, what would the supply chains look like today? I was a partner at Price Waterhouse in the supply chain practice. You never put all of your links into the same jurisdiction. We need to figure out how to better integrate, find best in class. If somebody comes up with a platform that's more impressive than the F-35, that, by the way, Mr. President, is why I said y'all were a badass country, because on a per capita basis, we would have to have 10 times, 20 times more to match your per capita representation. We find best practices, we build on them, but we build resilient supply chains that are ready for hopefully a conflict that never occurs. And I think we're exposed right now. So instead of competing, let's figure out how we can actually create synergy by working together. I don't think you put your eggs in any one basket. I'm clearly unapologetically pro-American and pro-innovation, but I think the best innovation comes from having tighter alliances, because the deeper our economic alliances and strategic alliances go, the further our relationships and alliances will go over time.
We're almost out of time. I'm going to take one very quick last question from Mike Froman, sitting right here. In row 4, the mic is making it over to you. A quick one, please.
I think one of the challenges of this conversation is how it relates to the actual power in the world. You get the United States and China basically following their own set of rules. It's hard to imagine China agreeing to the kind of reforms you'd want to see in the WTO to deal with the challenges of the Chinese economic system. It's hard to see the United States agreeing to change governance in the institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN Security Council. How do you address your agenda that's been laid out here in the context of actually how power is allocated in the world right now?
Director General, I'll just give you a very quick last word on this.
Never say never. China has benefited from the multilateral system. It just got out of special and differential treatment after many years of resisting. There's something at the WTO, sorry, if you call yourself a developing country, which China does, and by the way, they didn't invent it. I found an institution in which any member can define themselves the way they want, something which is strange. Now, they call themselves a developing country, but at the WTO, if you do that, it entitles you to implement agreements with a longer period of time to get exemptions and other benefits. One of the things the US really didn't like, and they were right, because it was stopping poor countries from really benefiting, is China benefiting. So we worked hard to get China, and they withdrew from special and differential treatment. No one thought they would do it. So I had a boss who used to tell me, Jim Wolfenson, if someone opens the door a crack, put your foot in and push. Maybe the crack will widen, and maybe it won't. Let's not give up on China doing reforms until we try it, and then they say we're absolutely not going to do it. Will it be easy? No. But let's not give up before trying.
Let's bottle up that enthusiasm and optimism and thank our panel, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, President Stubb, Vice Chancellor Klingbeil, and Senator Tillis. Thank you so much for being here.